want to bring in my guests. I am joined with the man himself, Tim Anderson. Tim Anderson is a writer, internationalist, academic, and director of the Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies. Tim, thank you for joining me, man. I really appreciate the commentary, our conversations. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Jamal.
Well, I know it's nighttime for you. It's nighttime for me. For the people on the East Coast, it's morning for them. I'm not going to keep you because I know it is late. But I am curious on, I guess, two fronts. The first, let's go to Iran first. Let's do Iran first. So, I think it's pronounced Arachi, has been doing interviews. He's on the press circuit. And as he's on the press circuit, he's having a conversation with Brett Baer. But he's also talking about enrichment. And he's taking a strong stance saying, look, we're going to continue enrichment. It may be down now, but we're going to get back to it. But then when asked about talks with the United States or the European Union, he is going to have talks with the European Union on enrichment. And I say to myself, why? These people, as you were being bombed and as your people were being murdered by Israel in an unprovoked attack, with the United States having full knowledge of it, the European Union backed the attack. They didn't say this is outrageous that Israel is doing this. Their response was the opposite of that. And so it's like, okay, so why are you having this conversation with the European Union in this case? And then for the United States, when asked about, hey, are you going to have talks with the US? They said, we're not planning on having direct talks. Okay, so you're open to having indirect talks. And they said, well, we're open to indirect talks if Donald Trump says he's not going to attack us. What am I missing here? Like, maybe it's me being an American. The notion that I'm going to talk to these people after they were backing the killing of my own seems outrageous. But maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, no, you're right to look at those tensions. I mean, of course, the reason why the Europeans and the government of my country too say what they say about that sneak attack on the Friday the 13th of June is because Israel is such a forward base for the US and for the idea of US influence in the whole region, in the whole West Asian region, basically. So they'll contemplate anything. I mean, they're all supporting to one degree or another the genocide in Gaza, you know. So what's to be said about bombing Syria or bombing Iraq or bombing Iran, you know? From Iranian point of view, which I think you started, piqued your interest, basically. There are some differences within Iran about how they approach this. But, you know, from my point of view, I agree with you, you know, that what's in it for Iran, any of these nuclear talks, really? They want to have a nuclear power industry. They want to use it for research, and that includes medicine and so on. There's a number of things that nuclear research and nuclear industry is geared towards, basically. And the Iranians have made it very clear that that's what they want it for. They don't want nuclear weapons. If there's been some discussion more recently about weapons only because they're being threatened incessantly, you know, for decades, effectively, about it. But that's coming from people who are very frustrated and think maybe they'll back off if we have a nuclear weapon. But the problem is they've been telling us all for decades how immoral it is to have nuclear weapons because they're so indiscriminate. Who's going to believe that Iran is going to use it? Basically, even if they had one, basically. I suppose there's still an argument that you could say, well, they could retaliate with one if they were attacked with one. But, you know, that's another story. Look, I think the whole idea of talks, and they're indirect talks because, let's remember, the US and Iran don't have diplomatic relations. The Iranians closed the embassy down in 1979. If you go to Iran, you can see it. It's a museum now, the nest of spies. And next door to it is the Imad Mughniya training school for young revolutionaries. Basically, that was the ambassador's residence, you know. So there is no direct diplomatic relations. That's why they have these indirect talks, basically. So the last ones were in Oman, I think, in Muscat, which is a nice quiet part of the just outside the Persian Gulf there. But they're indirect talks, and why do the Iranians have the talks at all? Because they're not going to contemplate the idea of totally shutting down their industry, which is what the Trump regime was asking of them. And they said, no, they're not going to do that. What are they talking about? I think that you have to recognize that we have to recognize that some things are done mainly for diplomatic reasons, that people don't want to seem to be unreasonable. They want to be seen to be open, to be talking, to discussing things if the other side has a genuine interest. In my view, it's always been an attempt at unilateral disarmament of the Iranians, because the other side has been trying to add conditions about their missile program. Initially, it was about the missile program, which could be nuclear capable and so on. Now they're worried, obviously, because clearly Iran has some very powerful targeted weapons, which are not weapons of mass destruction. They're able to target their military and infrastructure objectives very precisely, as we saw last month when they knocked out the Haifa refinery and a number of other places. We didn't see it all because the Israelis, of course, have military sensors on all the things that people can show, basically. But they've recognized, I think, the latest concession by the Israelis was, they said in the second half of that 12-day war, they blocked, they weren't able, 16% of the Iranian missiles got through. That's what the Israelis will admit. So at least 16% of those missiles got through. So it's a very effective arsenal that the Iranians have, and they have it buried all around the country. It can't be destroyed in one strike, or if at all, basically. So there's often been talk ever since 2015 of trying to extend the so-called nuclear agreement to cover other things. And the aim, of course, is to try and disempower Iran as a force in the region, as a force supporting the Palestinian resistance, supporting Hezbollah, supporting Yemen, supporting, when there was an independent Syria, supporting Syria, and supporting the resistance in Iraq, which is still important, but constrained by the occupation there. So from the Iranian point of view, I think they're doing it mainly for diplomatic reasons, to show that they're reasonable people. This is their style of diplomacy, after all. Even when they carry out war, they do it very politely. When they struck the US base in Al Udeida base in Qatar, they gave Qatar many hours advance notice. All of the airspace was shut down, basically. I remember seeing, hours before that strike. We don't know exactly what happened there, except we know that one radar installation was destroyed. We don't know what else happened because of the censorship from the US side there. But they gave them a lot of advance warning when they were firing missiles at the Israelis. I was actually traveling through the Persian Gulf at that time, and certain flights were shut down, but traffic was still going on because the Iranians were, civilized enough to let the airlines know what was going on and what time of the day it was going on, basically. So they, I think, are having these indirect talks with the US mainly to show that they're reasonable and to keep the high moral ground, because after all, it was Trump that tore up that agreement in 2015. They reached some sort of agreement with Obama back there. Obama didn't respect it entirely anyway. It was never respected, so the Iranians gradually rolled it back. But I think the Iranians felt we can hold the high moral ground here. We committed to an agreement. We maintained it as long as we were able to, and the other side tore it up. So why shouldn't we keep having these indirect talks? And at one stage, they're having them in Europe, and they're trying to persuade the Europeans, I suppose, to stick to their view of resuming normal economic relations with Iran. They never did, because the Europeans haven't got the spine to stand up to Washington, basically. So, but nevertheless, I think it's mainly a diplomatic effort there, because there's nothing in it for Iran except for the lifting of sanctions. And now we've got the Europeans to some extent, and the US to a greater extent, imposing other sanctions for all sorts of other reasons on Iran. So what's left in it there for Iran other than diplomacy, basically?
I guess that's kind of my point. I think the moral high ground is overrated. I mean, Israel is literally committing a genocide. They don't care about the moral high ground. The United States backs them in that genocide and pays for a large share of it. We don't care about the moral high ground. Europe stood by while they were being attacked and cheered on the fact that they were being attacked. They didn't care about the moral high ground. Why should Iran? And just to be very clear what I mean by this, I don't mean that Iran should go indiscriminate killing people. That's not what I mean. I just mean they were in negotiations. They were attacked unprovoked in the middle of those negotiations. And apparently the US had told them that they weren't going to be attacked while they were negotiating. So there is no impetus for them to have these talks. There's nothing, as you point out, to gain from those talks, whether it's with Europe or the United States, especially if what they're talking about is, well, we want zero enrichment. Whether you're talking to the Europeans or whether you're talking to Americans, if they're saying the same thing, what is the point of those talks when that's not what you're ever going to do anyway? I don't know. Iran annoys me a lot with this, because to me it's like, dude, why are you doing that?
Once upon a time in Iran, back in 2015, the Rouhani administration, there was almost a bit of a cult amongst the liberal faction of politics in Iran, and now there's a president who's of the liberal faction, but said by some to be a moderate liberal. In other words, sort of in the centre of things. That they call it principalists and reformers or liberals. Basically, a lot of the liberals really believed in this idea of re-engaging with the West, and it was going to be all fine and dandy. There was going to be open commercial relations, and indeed, a large section of the Iranian middle class still likes the idea to a certain degree of a more liberal economic relationship. They think there'll be some economic benefits in it. I think what happened with the sneak attack, as you pointed out, sneak on the part of the US as well as the Israelis of last month, is that it managed to unify the factions in Iran. It unified them all, saying these people have committed this unprovoked aggression on us, and we're going to respond, basically. Still, the response to the Israelis, of course, was much more powerful than anything we've seen before. It was restrained with the US. They didn't go and kill servicemen. They hit some facilities, so far as we know. We don't really know exactly, because remember when they struck the base in Iraq back in 2000, after Mr. Trump had assassinated General Soleimani and Mohandas, and two of the great heroes of anti-terrorism in that region. There was a strike, but it was still restrained on Al-Ain Air Force, Ain al-Assad Air Force Base in Iraq. I think initially they said there was no casualties. Later on, they said there was concussion injuries or brain injuries, or traumatic brain injuries, something like that. So we don't really know what happened at Al Udeid Air Force Base last month, but except it was restrained. It was clearly a restrained attack. The Iranians are concerned generally about escalation. They don't want escalation. They've been preparing for a war with the US, but they prefer not to have that. They'd rather have respond to the Israelis and separate them out. The problem is, of course, that large sections of the US body politic regard Israel as a forward base of the US, basically. I know within the US there's this debate that Israel is controlling the US, or why are we sacrificing our own interests for the sake of the Israelis? But another way to look at it is that it's a forward base of the US, and therefore, if there's an existential threat to the Israeli entity, it's likely that the US is going to intervene to a greater extent, basically. I think the intervention by Trump last month was really just to call a pause because the Israelis were running out of their expensive weapons and expensive missiles that are fired as air defense, and they're stocking up now, ready for the second round, basically. But that attack by Trump certainly was a sneaky, unprovoked thing, but it was to give the Israelis a chance to breathe, really, because I think that there's still this wariness about, if the attack escalates against Israel, Israel can be wiped out effectively. All of its functional mechanisms in terms of military and infrastructure can be wiped out. They're offshoring their jet planes now on the British military base in Cyprus. So they everyone knows that their air defense is not as great as they made it out to be, basically. But nevertheless, they're relying on a lot of foreign support from the Germans, from the British, from the North Americans, from a number of the allies of the US in the region, from the Saudis, from Jordan, and so on, to protect their regime. And if there is an existential crisis, and Iran and its allies could bring that about, if they really want to wipe out this apartheid regime, which is the mother of the genocide and the war crimes, of course. That's the problem. Is around the world, even amongst the big counterweights in the world like Russia and China, they're still saying, oh, well, two-state solution. But what does that mean? Recognizing an apartheid regime, which is the mother of these crimes, basically. Yeah. At the moment, Iran, or the government of Iran, let's say, is relying on a self-defense rationale. And that means the initiative is still with the Israelis. It means they're going to defend themselves if they're attacked again. It's very likely they're going to be attacked again, basically. They're getting ready for that. They've repaired, they say, their air defenses and so on. But it means they're on the back foot still, really. And Israel has the, if not the upper hand, at least it's going to make the first move, I believe, in terms of a second round of fighting.
It just seems like this plan of nuclear enrichment is the worst of both worlds. In one sense, 2 points on that. One, when Iran is always talking about this, they're talking about this almost like it's an issue of sovereignty, full stop, right? Like, I don't have to justify it. Me, something that I'm doing in my own country. Full stop. It's like the U.S. doesn't justify building nuclear weapons, so don't come to me and ask me to justify me doing something similar. And they're not even building nukes, even though there are many of us, like myself, who say they should build a nuke. They should have built that nuke already at this point. Would Israel have attacked if indeed they had nukes? That's a good question. But that's not the direction they go with it. They say we're just building up to 60%, and we're using this for various research purposes. It just seems like the worst of both worlds. Do you think Israel would have attacked Iran if they had a nuke?
It's hard to say, because I think if you look at, people make the comparison with North Korea and they say, well, look at North Korea,
Right.
and there was a big threat against them in 2017, which was resolved with some diplomacy the following year. But I think with North Korea, you have to bear in mind they have a different style of diplomacy to the Iranians too. States carry out their resistance in different ways. The North Koreans' view of diplomacy is, don't mess with us, we're crazy, we'll do anything, basically. And people believe, I don't think it's true, actually, by the way. They're much more, when you talk to them, they're much more reasonable people, but they have that image, don't they? They have that image. They say, well, these guys have got a nuclear weapon and they're mad, and so we better not, poke them or upset them, basically. Whereas the Iranians have been telling us for 40 years, nuclear weapons are immoral. They're forbidden to have this type of warfare, that's going to necessarily incinerate hundreds of thousands of basically. So their style of diplomacy, it's not just the possession of a nuclear weapon, it's the style of diplomacy goes with it, basically. And so the Iranians have relied on putting out their values in their diplomacy, basically. And I'm not sure that the Iranians would be that credible. It may be that it would be a deterrent in terms of if the Israelis thought, well, they can't respond, they won't respond if we attack their nuclear. By the way, apparently their nuclear facilities, the one that was buried very deep, was too deep even for most nuclear blasts to get to, basically. The nuclear could perhaps penetrate 500 meters, but not, is it 500 meters or? Anyway, it can't get to the depth in which those facilities are in. So maybe there was some deterrence in having one, in that the other side would think that they might respond with one if they were attacked with one. Certainly, according to their diplomacy, that they're not going to be thought to carry out a first strike. In fact, the only state in the world that has actually not renounced first strike ability is the US, basically. And the world knows that they've used them, and they've used them against civilian cities too, because Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not military targets. It was a demonstration for the beginning of the Cold War against the Soviet Union at the time, and they used it on civilian cities.
But it makes no sense as a military plan. I mean, they're going to get pegged to death. And under this model, every time Israel's about to lose, or every time Israel takes, too much damage, the U.S. can step in, attack, in which case you pause it again. And this repeating process of attack and pause, with Israel always have the distribution of force, because ultimately they always have nuclear weapons. This doesn't seem like a winning strategy to me. And maybe I'm getting this wrong, but give me your take on this.
You mean from the Iranian point of view?
Yeah, from the Iranian point of view. Because imagine for the moment that this happens again, Israel attacks, which it will at some point. And then if it gets to the point where it seems like Israel is once again losing, the U.S. comes in order to effectively say stop, in which case you get another pause, giving Israel time to reload and attack once again. I'm saying this doesn't seem like a winning strategy, especially since at the end of the day, Israel has nukes. Iran knows Israel has nukes. And so Iran is always measured in the way that it's going to go after Israel in its response.
Partly for that reason, and partly because they see the escalation with the US. Yeah, that's what they're preparing for, basically. But look, there's a genuine tension, I believe, in Iran. I'm of the opinion myself that there is no end to this constant cancer, as they call it, in the region. It's the Iranians have called this a cancer.
Yes.
Israel, that really they've attacked every independent regime in the region, basically. There's a couple like Egypt and Jordan that have made their own peace agreements, but basically the Israelis have invaded Lebanon multiple times. They're invading Syria again. They're trying to annex more of Syria. We know that they want more and more of the territory in the region. They're doing it step by step. The Iranian leader has said, Khamenei has said that If you give in to them on the nuclear enrichment, they'll come for the missiles. They'll come for other things after that. There's no end to it, basically. But at this stage, the Iranian government is relying on its Article 51 of the UN Charter right to self-defense. So they haven't moved to a rationale which says that, first of all, and the Yemenis have, by the way, Yemenis say we have obligations under the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide to intervene on behalf of the Palestinian people directly, not asking for anyone's permissions. Yemenis have done that already. There is also a very good argument that the fight with the Israelis should be to dismantle the apartheid regime, because that's the root of most of the crimes going on, and there's no end to it until that regime is dismantled. But at the moment, that's not the basis on which the Iranians are fighting, are responding to the Israelis. I think there's a very good argument to be made that this is, after all, apartheid is a crime against humanity. That's UN resolutions on that, and there's a responsibility on the international community to dismantle an apartheid regime for that reason. And you can't keep mouthing this pretext of a two-state solution, which implies recognizing the apartheid regime, which is committing genocide against its neighbors or its inhabitants, if there's already a single state in historic Palestine, basically. But at this stage, there isn't, that rationale is not being put out openly. And this is, I suppose, also the question of, would the Israelis be mad enough to respond if they fear that the regime is going to collapse with nuclear weapons? And to what extent would the US intervene in support? And would the US use nuclear weapons in those circumstances too? Because I think we've seen from Russia that the Russians have said that they've forsworn a first use of nuclear weapons, but they have added a proviso now to say if there's an existential threat to the state, they might consider it. And that's the problem with the Israelis now. They haven't signed any non-proliferation treaty. They haven't. They refuse to confirm or deny their possession of nuclear weapons, and it's uncertain to what extent or in what circumstances they might use them. So there, we're stuck with a dilemma that you mentioned. The Iranians are, in a conservative mindset, are continue to use the self-defense rationale. But there's an argument to be made in the region, it's being made by some people in the region, like in Yemen, that there is a greater mandate to put an end to this regime, basically, which is causing so much grief to all the people in the region.